We can start with the
presentation.
Yeah. So welcome all. I am really very glad that I can greet you for the first Methane Monday in this year. We had a long winter break and winter sleep, but doesn't matter. We will start with excellent presentation of IEA methane tracker. Before that, just few things which most of you following us already know. That this webinar is organized by 3 organizations jointly: Energy Community, GIE, and Marcogas, and we started more than 2 years ago with the idea to explain everything about upcoming European regulation, but in the meantime, it started to be wider and broader and deeper, and we brought actually many aspects of methane emissions, not only for gas industry, but also for energy industry as such. For this year, actually, what we have agreed already is actually financing. This topic, so far we didn't have it, so it's coming to April. We agreed with Global Methane Hub and EBRD to deliver presentations. Let's see if some other financial institution will come. We agreed about a roundtable on transparency, looking very much to it. Then we also agreed for 2 actually webinars, which will be more dedicated or more focused on oil and gas industry, oil and gas producers, let's put in that way. This next one in April, still to be confirmed details, but more or less the agreement is here. And today we have IEA speakers, excellent experts, and already known to Methane Mondays and to you. And we are really very glad that we will have this presentation on new methane tracker for this year, almost exclusively, because it's just 2 weeks after publishing. But what is most interesting is that at this time, besides gas and oil industry or gas and oil sector, coal is for the first time also included. So with not more words, floor is open for Tomas and for Casey to start with presentation, and then we will have time for questions and answers. Please, I see Casey will be the first one. Please.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Carolina, for giving us the opportunity to present the Global Methane Tracker, as well as some of our other recent work on methane. So just to say that the Global Methane Tracker, we released it's an annual publication, and we released the 2023 edition just 2 or 3 weeks ago now. So it's really hot off the press, and we're happy to be able to share some of the key messages that have come out of this year's tracker. So I will do a brief introduction to what's in the tracker, and then I'll also then pass it off to Tomas to walk through a few other elements. So if you can go to the next slide, please, Tomas. Thanks. So where are we today on methane emissions? Our methane tracker provides the IEA's best estimate of where the emissions from the energy sector are based on the latest science studies, measurements, and satellite data. So first, there's some good news here. There were a number of signs of progress in 2022 in tackling methane emissions. Satellite detected large leaks fell by about 10% in 2022, and preliminary estimates indicate a mixed picture on flaring, but with some reductions. However, the emissions intensity of production in general is still far too high and not falling fast enough. So despite the progress, we estimate that energy-related methane emissions rose in 2022, given the general increase in fossil fuel production that also took place in 2022. This increase is perhaps all the more surprising because the record gas prices we saw in 2022, alongside the security of supply concerns and all of the economic uncertainty. And of course, there is also the ever-pressing need to tackle climate change. So tackling methane is among the most important, if not the most important thing that can be done to limit the near-term global warming. And as a reminder, if we are on track to reach net zero emissions for the energy sector and limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius, methane emissions from the energy sector needs to fall by around 75% just by 2030. So if we're really going to achieve that level of reduction, then we will need new and stronger policies and regulations across many, many countries. There has been some continued progress on this front, both in 2022 and 2021. And at the international level, the momentum behind the global methane pledge continues to grow. Now there's over 150 countries in the GMP, up from around 110 at the end of last year, or end of 2021. And it's not just joining the pledge, but there's also been new signs of action underneath the pledge. So over 50 countries have already released either national methane action plans or have started to work on them with a commitment to release them in the coming months. And at the same time, we've seen new regulations implemented last year in both Colombia and Nigeria. There's also new action on methane in the US with a new methane charge that was included in the Inflation Reduction Act. And there's also been continued progress on regulatory proposals, both in the US and in the EU. So at the same time, there's also been voluntary industry efforts. The Oil and Gas Climate Initiative last year announced a new aiming for zero methane emissions initiative, and other organizations such as Methane Guiding Principles are also developing new actions and new activities. But really, now is the time that we need much more on-the-ground action to convert these high-level commitments into real action on the ground that reduces emissions. So one of the most promising areas that we've seen in recent years on this front is in terms of the detection and monitoring of methane emissions. Satellite and other continuous monitoring systems are providing a huge boost to methane abatement prospects and bringing up much needed transparency, especially for very large leaks that are detectable by satellite. For the first time ever, we saw satellites detecting methane emissions from offshore areas in 2022, including the major leak from the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage. And different groups are putting these data to good use. We work closely with the International Methane Emissions Observatory, or IMEO, and we'd also, of course, like to thank IMEO, their science teams, and some satellite providers, Kairos and GHGSat, for great collaboration this year and discussions that helped us bring together the global methane tracker. And one very concrete example of the new power of satellites is their ability to rapidly detect and help address large leaks. At the beginning of this year, the IMEO, supported by us at the IEA, launched the Methane Alert and Response System, or MARS. MARS will use satellite monitoring capabilities to identify major methane emissions events, quickly notify the host country and operator, and then assist countries, companies, and governments and other stakeholders to mitigate and learn from these events that we can already see by satellite. But it's important to put this satellite emissions into context. But last year, there were more than 500 super emitting events that were seen by satellites at oil and gas operations across 20 countries, including the explosion at the Nord Stream pipeline, as well as around 100 events at coal mines. These super emitting events are responsible for a large level of emissions, and they receive a lot of media attention, and deservedly so. They should be a focus of efforts if we're serious about cutting and reducing methane. But it's important to place the level of these big events into context. Emissions from normal oil and gas operations, including venting, fugitive emissions, and flaring emissions from some of the highest emitting countries, absolutely dwarf those coming from satellite detected super emitting events. So in essence, globally, normal oil and gas operations are responsible for more than one Nord Stream size methane event every single day. So that just means that efforts to tackle super emitting events need to come hand in hand with measures to reduce the kind of normal emissions associated with basic operations at oil and gas sites. They really have to go hand in hand. And fortunately for the industry, there are a whole array of different options available to cut down on these emissions. Our latest estimates is that we could reduce methane emissions from oil and gas by around 3/4 using just existing technologies. And what's interesting is that based on the price levels that we've seen in recent years, that's before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, about half of these measures could be deployed at no net cost. This is because methane, which is the main component of natural gas, if you avoid emissions of methane, it means you can then potentially sell that recaptured methane and you can make an overall profit as long as the cost of the abatement measure is lower than the value of that gas. But of course, that's the picture from 27 to 2021 prices. But in 2022, we obviously had very high prices, much higher than normal. And at the prices seen in different regions around the world, the vast majority of options to reduce emissions worldwide would be implemented or could be implemented at no net cost. So that just means that this year we had a particularly strong moment, and there's never been a better time. At the same time, because methane is such a potent greenhouse gas, no matter what the price is, tackling methane emissions is still one of the most cost-effective ways to limit near-term global warming. If we wanted to bring about a 75% reduction in oil and gas emissions in 2030, we estimate this would require around $100 billion in spending over the period between now and 2030. The oil and gas industry last year in 2022 made more than $4 trillion. So spending just a small fraction of that income on methane mitigation would essentially allow for a huge increase in action. And essentially what we found is a small percentage of that, 3% of that, could address all of the methane emissions you see on this curve, or about 75%. So this wasteful leakage of methane is all the more striking given today's backdrop of increasing energy security concerns. This is something that we have been emphasizing quite strongly over the course of the past year at the IEA. And reducing methane emissions and flaring from oil and gas operations could make more than 200 BCM of gas available to the market. This is comparable to the amount that Russia exported to Europe prior to its invasion of Ukraine. This wasted gas is also often within close reach of markets. About half of all flared volumes are within 20 kilometers of an existing gas pipeline. And there are some examples where this has been done quite quickly. Recently, a dedicated gas pipeline was put in place in less than a year in Egypt to move about 50 million cubic meters of natural gas per year to an existing gas processing facility that's about 20 kilometers away. And obviously, this can be a big reduction in flaring, and there's many examples of this type of project that can address the flaring risks. So in addition to providing numbers at the IEA, we also are working to push real-world action and implementation. Last year, in the week following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we published a 10-point action plan on how the EU could rapidly reduce reliance on Russian gas. And this included how cuts to flaring and methane venting could quickly boost gas supply to the EU. We also looked at the general energy security case for action on methane. Separately, as tools for policymakers, we have published a regulatory roadmap and policy toolkit on oil and gas, which has become the go-to source for regulators looking to develop new and impactful methane regulations. And with the release of the updated methane roadmap, Thomas, we also, or with the release of this year's Global Methane Tracker, we released a companion piece for policymakers and regulators on coal mine methane emissions. And Thomas will take us through those two publications shortly. And finally, I'd also note that the IEA works closely with a number of different international organizations, including the IMEO, which I mentioned already, as well as the World Bank, and industry organizations like the Methane Guiding Principles to help bring about greater emissions transparency and emissions management across the fossil fuel industry. And with that, I think I'll hand it now over to Thomas. One of the big things that we did in the 2023 methane tracker that's new is we have a very expanded analysis on coal mine methane, potential abatement in coal, as well as regulatory options. Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you, Casey, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
Okay, great. I haven't figured out how to share my camera while I share my screen, but I think we'll be able to do that once we go to the Q&A. So let's just start off with some of the findings that we had. So now the methane tracker provides this overview of all abatement options for fossil fuel operations, and these are the bulk of the energy sector methane emissions. And what you can see here is that indeed the greatest abatement potential is in the oil and gas industry, but still reductions on coal mine methane decay can make a big difference. And here you can see some of the options for oil and gas. You're probably already familiar with this, but we have technology standards, leak detection and repair programs, zero routine flaring and venting. But when we go to coal, there's the option of abating ventilation air methane. In the coal industry, methane is essentially, first and foremost, a security issue. So companies ventilate underground coal mines so that there's not an explosion hazard, but this means that often this methane will just end up in the atmosphere, and there's the possibility to either oxidize it, to destroy it, so that you reduce its climate warming potential, or to use it to do things like coal drying or mine heating. Another important option is mine degasification. So before you start operations in a new coal seam, you can drain it from its gas content, and this will often give methane with gas with a high methane concentration, which can be processed and then either put into a pipeline or used to generate electricity, or make use of its energy in another way. And so what you can see here is essentially that Casey was mentioning before, the net zero emissions by 2050 scenario. And there we have a reduction in emissions, methane emissions from fossil fuels to 2030 of about 75%. But just looking at the reduction potential with known and existing technologies, we have an abatement potential of 70%. So this really takes us most of the way. The difference there, these 5%, is more related to reductions in consumption. But you see here that the industry has already all the tools it needs to kind of deliver on this kind of scenario. And now going a little bit more into coal and coal mine methane, you can see here a more detailed view of the abatement options. Coal operations emitted about 14 million tons of methane in 2022. That is more or less the same amount that either the oil sector or the gas sector emitted. So it's quite significant. If you look at methane emissions from China, the world's largest coal user and coal producer, but also the largest emitter of coal mine methane, these methane emissions are equivalent to all CO2 emissions from sub-Saharan Africa. So it's really a major source of emissions. And certainly cutting coal consumption is very important. It will reduce emissions. It will be particularly efficient where it's easy to replace coal, such as in the power sector. But deploying mitigation measures should still be a priority, in particular for coking coal, which is often produced in underground mines, where mitigation is easier, and there are many options to reduce methane there. And also coking coal is used for steel making, and there's not that many options right now to replace it, at least in a cost-effective measure. So it's quite important also to tackle coal mine methane emissions. And if you look at the information of the main sources of coal mine methane, you see that emissions are very concentrated on a handful of countries. We have already spoken about China, but there are a few other major coal producers which are responsible for a large share of methane emissions. The top 8 largest emitters account for over 90% of total coal mine methane. And you see here Russia, Indonesia, India, United States, Australia, South Africa, and Kazakhstan are some of the main emitters there. It is interesting to note that there's a bit of a difference also in terms of the intensity, that is the amount of methane that is released by the amount of coal that is produced. And you can see here that, for example, Russia and Kazakhstan have a higher emissions intensity than, say, Australia or the United States. This is due to a combination of different elements. One of them is just the depth of the mine. So the deeper a mine is, normally then you have a higher methane content and higher methane emissions, depending also on the type of coal. So if you're producing anthracite, coking coal, these generally have a higher methane content than steam coal or bituminous coal or lignite, which are generally used for electricity in the power sector. But also there's the element of policy and industry practice. In some of these places, including the United States and Australia, there are projects to recover coal mine methane, to use it, or to flare it or abate it in a different way. So that can also be play an important role in reducing emissions and the intensity of coal mine methane. And here you can see, you're already familiar with the MAC, the marginal abatement cost curve for oil and gas. Now we have developed this marginal abatement cost curve for coal. And you can see that there's actually a bit of coal mine methane that could be abated at no net cost. This is essentially where coal mine methane is available in high concentrations and in high volumes and can be captured and drained to be utilized. We generally model this as a power generation, but it can be used for different purposes. And then once you go to other abatement options, it starts to be more costly, but still you can see that the range here until we go to $20 per gigajoule of energy, it's still not a very high price. It is higher than in the oil and gas industry, but it's not that high when you compare it with other mitigation options for reducing climate change. Now, you might also be familiar with some of the barriers that the oil and gas industry faces, such as regulatory issues or mixed incentives. These are also present in the coal industry, but there's a bit more of an element of economic barriers and also resource rights that need to be tackled, so that these issues around the ownership of methane in coal mines that are often not clear and need to be made clear so that companies can reduce coal mine methane emissions. I would also like to highlight that there's a big difference in what you can do about coal mine methane between underground and surface mines. In surface mines, emissions are very often diffuse and very hard to capture, so the abatement potential is very small. You can, in some mines where the coal seams are a little bit deeper, and depending on the kind of operations, you can implement degasification systems and then use or flare the methane. But for the most part, the abatement potential at surface mines is very small compared to the abatement potential at underground mines, when you often already have ventilation systems that direct methane to outside the mine, and then it's a bit easier to deploy abatement technologies there. And fortunately, as I was mentioning, coking coal, which is harder to replace for industrial purposes, is generally produced at underground mines, so it's easier to abate coal mine methane related to coking coal than, for example, for steam coal, which is a bit easier to replace in the power sector. Now, just final 2 slides, going a little bit into the coal mine methane regulatory roadmap. Some of you might know the version that we did for the oil and gas sector. This is not that different. It uses the same set of 10 steps that you can see here on the screen, which are around 3 kind of groups or elements: understanding the setting, what are the major emission sources, what is the nature of the industry, what are the key players, and who might regulate methane emissions. A second group of elements on regulatory design, thinking about what are the key stakeholders, what are the regulatory objectives, what is the best policy design and policy approach for these objectives and the setting in the region. And finally, a group on implementation, how you can enable and enforce compliance, how can you review the policy, how can you refine it going forward. And together with this roadmap, there is also a policy toolkit. And here you can see the main elements of this policy toolkit that helps policymakers think about starting from the regulatory structure all the way down to specific elements of policy design. So if your approach is going to be more case by case, by general applicable regulations, and then if you're going to take an economic measure, an information-based measure, a performance-based measure, or a prescriptive measure. And here you can see some examples, both for the oil and gas sector and for the coal sector. And finally, how you can go about monitoring, reporting, and verification so that you can ensure that your policy takes effect and works properly, and also how you can coordinate methane policies with other policies, say on energy, and how these can be mutually supportive. So with that, I'm going to close and very happy to take questions from you all.
Thank you very much to both. I mean, really interesting, and from one side also astonishing, because yeah, we are looking in those data from year to year, and recommendations what can be reduced and how can be reduced, but we really reach in 2023 the year of action, because methane as a greenhouse gas, I mean, took this place and found this role, and I think that most of institutions and companies, they realize that it's bad if it's not much worse than CO2, but it's really time for action. And here we had a question in chat that understanding is here, but it's also understanding that actually Europe as such doesn't have big role, or we can do everything, but then this reduce and impact will be still small. So how was it actually? That was my question. How was it in collecting this data and putting this all together for coal? And how is actually in communication between IEA and all these big emitters, and maybe even with UN? So having report is fine, but then to put this report in the action, it's another story. So maybe you can help us to explain how this goes.
Thanks. Thanks for that. Maybe I'll start, and then Thomas, feel free to jump in. I mean, there's a few different reactions I have to this point. I mean, I take the point that Europe's relative emissions compared to some big producers is relatively speaking quite low, and of course I think we all acknowledge the need that even those emissions are still ones that need to be addressed. So like setting aside the question of what can be done within Europe, there's a couple of very interesting things when we think about the European Union, and we know that they're starting to discuss what could be done on imported emissions. So we also have, if we think about the EU's emissions as not just those that take place within the EU's borders, but also those that take place associated with production that eventually makes it to the EU, then suddenly the EU is actually quite a big player and has quite a big amount of potential leverage. And obviously we know the European Union is having some discussions about this. I mean, it's obviously a slower process than what happens domestically, but we do know that they are talking about what could be done as a next step looking towards the imported emissions. There's different elements, different tools. We won't go into those, and I'm not going to spend much time on those, but just knowing and being aware that that is possible. But on the other element of the question about what we see when we speak to some of these countries, it does depend quite a lot. I mean, obviously the countries have very different approaches. But we do have a lot of conversations with different countries that are maybe more on the upstream side outside of Europe. And this is part of the reason that we put together the regulatory roadmap and toolkit, both for oil and gas and for coal. So the idea is we are trying to find ways to bring those regulatory options and policy options to countries that have recognized the need for this. And I think that Global Methane Pledge is a great a way in. It's a tool, it's a great conversation starter. It's showing that a lot of these countries have already committed to doing something. So even some very large emitters are on that list, but there's also a bunch of small emitters that can work, that together add up to a lot of emissions. And we do see a lot of interest there. So we have some ongoing conversations with Algeria, with other countries that Ghana, some countries in Latin America and in Africa. So we do have some of those discussions. And I do think that there is some interest to do something. There's some recognition, and there's also some recognition of the potential power of that kind of action. And the last thing I just wanted to mention specifically on coal, a huge proportion of the emissions from coal coming from China as the largest producer, the largest user, the largest emitter of coal mine methane. But at the same time, there are good examples that are from China, and in our roadmap, we identify a number of different policy actions, and there's some examples that are already coming out of different policy tools in China to try to improve the uptake of coal mine methane utilization. And they will be expected to release a national methane action plan later this year that is really supposed to say what are the domestic actions that can happen there on methane. So that's just to say there is some encouraging signs. There are still some countries that we haven't seen much action for, but the hope is that this level of, we can kind of get a snowball effect of a bunch of countries start to do something, show that it's possible, show that it can be done cost effectively, and that'll make it easier for those that are maybe moving a little bit more slowly. Thomas, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Yeah, sure. I think just a little bit more color, so to speak. We have been working with a few different institutions on this to kind of highlight the importance for both small and big emitters. So, for example, we are working with the Climate and Clean Air Coalition. They have these methane action roadmaps that they are developing with different countries. So we have presented the Global Methane Tracker to them 2 weeks ago, I think, or it was just after the release, and there were over 40 countries on the workshop. And there are many other groups that are working on this. So, for example, there's a company called Carbon Limits. They were organizing an event in Turkmenistan to talk a little bit about methane abatement. Similarly, the World Bank has done a lot of work on flaring on Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan and Nigeria. And we have been approached by several countries in the Africa region that are also kind of aiming to work more on methane. So as Casey was mentioning, I think there's really growing momentum for this, but we need to kind of keep it going. And one of the important things maybe to highlight to this group in this discussion is that often countries will come to the table and ask, okay, so what are the countries that have already done things on methane, have taken action, have deployed technologies, and have experience in policymaking? And it's really important when we have good examples to point to. So I think, hopefully Europe will come out with its methane regulation, and it will provide a very clear kind of benchmark or reference for other countries that are looking to take action, and maybe they can either be inspired by that or take that as a comparison. And it's not always about kind of policy making. It's also about what the industry is doing and what are some examples. So last year, when we developed this methane policy toolkit within the methane guiding principles, and we did different case studies on what are the different pathways for methane abatement, I think that was very useful because sometimes people have specific questions, say, oh, how can I deal with remote operations? What can I do with gas there? And so there we have a resource that we can point to and specify, what are the different countries doing about that. And I think Europe in particular can play a very important role in saying, this and this have already been done. These are very good examples, and how you may go about taking action on methane.
Thank you. It was extensive, and I am glad to hear this kind of optimism, because we have to look forward, and we have to look to these good examples and what can be actually done. I hope that this answer question put by Ms. Brandner about reaction on of these super emitters. And then we have more questions, but I don't know if Erwin or Antonio would like to put them with more explanation to take a floor, or shall we continue from the chat reading? So yes, Antonio, please, because you had several questions. Maybe better that you explain them.
Thanks, Carolina. My two questions are, the first one is referring to the remaining emissions in the gas sector. If you could explain where they come from in terms of sector or specific sources. And the second question is on the types of regulation. If you think from your perspective that it makes sense to combine prescriptive regulation and economic regulation in the same scope, let's say.
Great. Perhaps I can take this one and then you can jump in, Casey. So if I understand correctly, when you ask about the remaining emissions, these are the emissions that are not abatable, so to speak.
Exactly.
Perfect.
Exactly.
So the issue is that for most sources, we are not able to fully abate the source. So let me use an example. When we are talking about fugitive emissions, so these are emissions that occur because someone left open the hatch of a tank, or because there was an accident and a valve was malfunctioning for some period of time. These kind of accidents, we can reduce their emissions a lot by deploying continuous monitoring systems, for example. But you can't reduce them to zero. Some accidents will happen and it will take a little bit of time to fix them. So there will be kind of a remaining amount of emissions. And similarly, when we look at, for example, engines that are combusting methane, or even flares that are being used to combust methane, they will have a combustion efficiency, if well operated and well maintained, of over 99%, maybe even over 99.8%, but there will still be a 0.1, 0.2% that will escape, that will not be combusted, and that's unavoidable to a certain extent. Now, when we think about what is technically possible, it often comes to an issue of costs and how far you can go. Certainly, I mean, if you are willing to take any measure and spend all the money in the world, then you can probably get to 99% of reductions, just because you put in place a number of safety mechanisms. But just looking at what is the practice available, what are the well-known measures and reduction technologies, these kind of standard and very well-known technologies can reduce methane emissions by about 75%, maybe even a bit more. And then you would have these remaining emissions. For the second part, or your second question, I think we have seen many examples of regulation related with methane emissions that take different approaches at the same time. They have a component which is about information, that have a component which is about, say, we're banning all non-emergency venting or something like that, a very prescriptive element to it. But they also have an economic or even a performance. So there are many good examples where different approaches are used simultaneously to make sure that all sources of methane emissions are being tackled and that you have a comprehensive approach to regulating and driving down methane emissions. Casey, maybe you want to add a bit to that.
Maybe just I think the short answer to that is, I mean, I fully agree with Thomas on that answer about the different regulations. I think the key is about time. We don't, like, economic regulations in many ways, when we just think of like kind of regulatory theory and legal theory, are the most efficient and kind of best way to address any kind of pollution, at least in a theoretical sense. But until we have the data, until we have the full understanding to be able to apply them correctly and make sure that economic, like taxes, for example, really transmit the right incentives, that could take time, and we just don't have that kind of time. So the idea is these prescriptive regulations can be the thing that we can do today, and then eventually build towards more efficient and more effective regulatory systems over time. So in a way, I wouldn't say that they should be necessarily at the same time, as opposed to prescriptive can help be that short-term move that we can then build on in parallel as we improve data, improve emissions management, that sort of thing.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can also say thank you, and actually this is linked with other questions which Erwin Darmovan put in the chat. Maybe Erwin, if you would like to take the floor and maybe to explain more what is behind your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, I just wondered that the regulation related with the methane emission is maybe not all countries already have. Yeah, for example, maybe the EU or US has the more advanced in terms of regulation. So, what do you think about the other countries that maybe has the same target for reducing the methane, but yet the regulation is not really in place yet? Yeah. Thank you.
Maybe I can start on this one. I think that one of the things to say is that that methane regulation in general will be kind of, we see a lot of companies that are, sorry, let me start. We're seeing a lot of companies taking the steps forward, like companies saying, we're going to do this right, we're going to do this well, we're going to be an example. And that has a lot of, and that has value to it. Companies can show that it's possible, they can develop the mitigation options, develop the technologies, but especially in markets where there's many different actors, so places like the United States, it really is necessary to have regulatory action, because otherwise you might end up with kind of differences in companies. So if we want every company to take these actions, regulations are really the only way to reach that in a place where you have such a diverse kind of active marketplace. Just to say, on the opposite end of the spectrum, there are places where you might not see something that we might call a regulation. So places where most of the production is done by a national oil company, one very large company that's semi-controlled or partially controlled by the government, then what they do might not necessarily take the same frame as what regulation looks like in the United States. Because if that company can adopt policies that apply to it and all of its partners and all the operating partners in the country, then you can kind of reach to the same level with a company policy that you could with a government regulation. So I'm just trying to say that from our perspective, the end goal is not a regulatory structure that is kind of uniform or consistent across every single country, as opposed to some effective policy that reaches every corner of the industry. So anyway, I think that, at least from our perspective, we do think almost all countries should probably be considering this, especially those that are major producers and where there are, limited mechanisms to kind of force action among the industry. But there might be cases where national oil company action could be sufficient. And that depends very much on each individual country. So I hope that answers the question. In terms of my personal optimism, I do think there's lots of reasons to see positive signs from governments. There are a lot of governments that are looking at this for the first time, developing action plans, proposing new regulations, and I do think that that's becoming more common and becoming kind of expected, particularly from the downstream consumers. So I do think over time we will certainly see more and more across more different countries.
Yeah, and if I can just complement, I think we are seeing more and more policies on methane, but it's not really about the number of policies in a sense. You don't need to, in each and every country, have, say, 30 different policies that tackle methane in different segments and sectors in different ways. Each country and actually each jurisdiction will have its kind of tailored approach. It might be that for some places, this is just one overarching regulation that will have specific goals and be quite comprehensive. And it could even be simple, but it will get the job done. Whereas in other places, you might have a very kind of a different patchwork where you will have, say, the energy regulator doing a specific part of methane emissions, and then you will have, say, the transmission regulator tackling another part of emissions, and then you might have the health regulator taking a specific action on some points of the supply chain. So I think it will depend a lot from country to country. We don't really need to think that, oh, we need a lot of different, many policies to take care of this. But I do think that, following Casey's point, that every jurisdiction should consider this issue and should check that it is taking action in some sense and in an appropriate manner to reduce methane emissions.
Thank you. Thank you for answers. Now just crossed my mind because yes, the Global Methane Pledge is actually a great document to show dedication, and I'm just wondering, during preparation of your report, did you have a chance maybe to see documents which those 50 countries already submitted, like what they are going to do to reach this 30% decrease by 2030, or it's kind of under the under the UN.
Yeah, I can start from that. So I mean, we did do a review of the existing methane action plans that are announced. So we did read them all, or read all the ones that we could find publicly. I would just say that there's a lot of countries that have announced they are currently developing one, but haven't yet published it. So there, I think there'll be a lot more to say if you ask me this question 1 year from now. But at least from the countries that we have seen, so far, the countries like, for example, the U.S. has an action plan. I think we have one from well, obviously we have the EU, and a few countries in the EU have specific plans, like Sweden, for example. But there are a few countries a bit farther afield. Some of the long-standing action plans that address methane include, like, Nigeria has a short-lived climate pollutant action plan that's been around for several years, and then a few others. But I do think it very much depends on the country, because in many countries, this is really looking at methane across all sectors. So for example, Brazil has been developing a plan, and it's primarily focused on waste in agriculture. They obviously have several different things they are doing on oil and gas, because they do have some oil and gas emissions, but a lot of the area that they see as the place that they're driving priorities, because they're thinking about, you know, priorities over the next 10, 15 years, includes these other sectors. So that maybe that's only a partial answer to the question, but it does seem that regulation is on the table. Most of the countries looking at this are saying that they are going to be pushing their industry to do more through regulatory efforts or policy efforts, but also some of these other actions for kind of making investments, and also looking at other sectors. I received a question that was maybe just privately to me, so I wanted to maybe read that out, because I'm not sure you can see that, Carolina. I got a question from Bastien. Do you have a calculated abatement price for each ton of methane? So the question, I think, is when 75%, if 75% is abated at a cost of $100 billion, what is that average price per abated ton? I'm not sure if we can deliver that immediately, but I'll see. I'm looking at Tomas to see if he knows the answer, or can say a little bit more about what the relative cost of that abatement is.
Sure. So I don't have a number from the top of my head for that specific ask, but the methane tracker, it has a data explorer, and in the data explorer you can download the data for the methane abatement cost curve for oil and gas or for coal, and then each specific measure will be identified and will have a cost related to it. Now, the 100 billion value is all the spending needed from now to 2030 for methane abatement in the oil and gas industry. So that doesn't take into account any of the revenue for gas. And maybe just to make the case that, you know, this is super cost effective, even if gas had essentially no value, if we put on a price of about $15 US per ton of CO2 equivalent, using a global warming potential of 100 years, which is on the lower end, so to speak, more than 90% of the measures there would be cost effective. So this is really cheap when you take into account, you know, other options to reduce climate change.
Now we got a related question again from Antonio. I don't know if you can.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I was wondering about the 75% potential of methane abatement with current technologies, how that varies across countries or regions of the world, because I could imagine that some more advanced countries cannot reach such a high percentage with current technology. So can you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah. So again, in the Data Explorer, you can check all of the regions. I think we have about 70 regions, and then we have the detailed estimates for each one of them. This number does vary a bit. So if we look at, for example, Norway, which has already deployed a lot of the abatement technologies available, then I would have to check, but I think the abatement potential there is maybe around 50% or even a bit below that. And if you look at some of the countries where you have highest emissions, like Turkmenistan, for example, then the abatement potential will probably be over 80%. So there's a range there, but still, from these preliminary estimates, we believe that there is still a lot to be done in every region. In some regions more than others, but there's still a lot to be done.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. I would invite participants to raise the hands and put the questions. We still have some time. But until waiting for that, another question actually crossed my mind, because on your slides, actually you show potential what to reduce and how to reduce, or I mean, in which areas related to coal and gas and oil sectors. But here somehow I missed the time dimension. In a sense, like coming from actually from gas industry, I can imagine what would be stopping flaring or venting, and those measures would require, like, can be done next year in 2 years or whatever. But when you compare these measures for coal sector, is this kind of same time frame or it requires longer?
I would say that in general, abatement measures in the coal sector require a little bit more time than in the oil and gas sector. But I mean, as you know, this varies a lot from project to project. So let's say if you want to compare an old offshore oil and gas platform, where maybe installing a vapor recovery unit will require a lot of safety assessments, planning, a planned shutdown so that you can install the vapor recovery unit, and that might end up taking, you know, a number of years. If you compare that to, say, the easiest measure in the coal sector, where you might already have the place available and the installation might be relatively new, and you already have the ventilation system, you just need to plug in, say, oxidation unit, then that could be done maybe a matter of 6 months or something like that. It depends a lot from country to country, if you have a supplier available, if you need to import it, etc. But when you look at the industry in general, then you need less time to deploy the abatement technologies in the oil and gas sector than you need in the coal sector, both because of the availability of suppliers and of technologies, but also due to the kind of technical considerations that need to be taken into account. In the coal sector, you don't know what will be the methane concentration, you don't know what will be the methane flows. It takes a little bit more of time to assess what will be the methane abatement potential, what kind of capacity you need, how you're going to manage that, and then set up all the infrastructure needed to reduce emissions.
Thank you for that, bringing the main message. So it's all on case basis, and everybody should do maximum as can, I mean, appropriate to its plant or coal facility or whatever. So we have another question. I see Oleg raising the hand, so please take the floor.
Thanks. So the question is on the trade regulations. Are there regulations in place already somewhere or in consideration relating to the production, the associated emissions and the counting of emissions for internationally traded energy carriers, LNG, coal, and pipeline gas, and how that can be applied to incentivize methane abatement in producing countries?
Thomas, maybe you want to take this one. I mean, the short answer is, as of right now, no, there aren't any, but there are some under discussion. Maybe Thomas.
Yeah, I can add that I think on kind of a case-by-case basis, some LNG buyers have been asking for cargoes with reduced emissions, and this has been done that emissions have been offset, or that some specific cargoes have been monitored so that they know that the methane intensity of that natural gas supply chain is below 0.2% or even below that. But this is still kind of in its infancy. So we, as Casey was mentioning, we don't know of any country that has a clear policy where all import LNG or gas by pipeline has to meet some kind of emissions requirement. That said, I mean, we just saw last year this joint declaration from energy importers and exporters on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels. I believe the EU, United States, Japan, Canada, Norway, perhaps a few others signed that declaration. And it's a very strong call to reducing greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuels supply chains around the world. And that includes both oil and gas and coal, and essentially taking all the measures available to reduce emissions from the supply of these fuels. In the EU methane strategy, there is also provision about imported gas and imported oil. So this is definitely something that is on the table for the European Union, but we will have to see how it develops in terms of what will be the specific mechanism. And I think for now, the next step is certainly to develop a more established monitoring to have a clear picture of how much emissions are being caused by imported fuel by the EU.
Thank you for that. In the meantime, we almost reach end of our hour today. I put in chat link to full report on IEA page. The webinar is recorded, so it's going to be uploaded in few days and at our website, Marcogas website, GIE website, slides as well. So let's see if we still have maybe some question. No, that was actually my message. Yeah, additional question from Oleg, and then we can close. Please, Oleg.
Yeah, maybe just on the previous one. Can we have some kind of CBAM analog imposed by European Union for the gas imports? So is it something included in the current considerations on the gas and hydrogen package?
I believe that we will see that because it's still not approved, not adopted in EU. I mean, discussions are still ongoing. I mean, it is in procedure, so let's see towards summer or it's going to take place, I mean, adoption to take place in the second half of the year. To be honest, in methane regulation was not a lot of CBAM, but yeah.
I mean, just shortly here, because we're on top of time, but just to say that China has also been considering, in a sense, integrating methane emissions in its ETS. So, and both the US and the EU are, have some kind of ETS in place, and are talking about CBAM. So I do think that in the future, more kind of mid to long term, we might see methane as part of CBAM, but that will obviously depend on a lot of details and how policies evolve nationally and internationally.
And then final question from Ms. Brandner. So some details about the German system and how actually to get this information in Methane Tracker.
So Johanna, I believe we did speak about this last year or a couple of years ago, and I would be happy to follow up on that. I mean, the discussion with the oil and gas industry in Germany was essentially that we would very much like to have further data. If we do have detailed data on the emission sources, and this is based on measurement studies, then we are very happy to do our best to integrate this data. And I mean, this is a general approach for the methane tracker. The methane tracker is, in a sense, our best effort to produce country level abatement estimates, but it's definitely not the final word. This is the information we have available, considering data on oil and gas production, on oil and gas operations, on regulations that are available on the satellites that are working and up and running, and a few other sources. But if any one of you knows a specific study that went out and measured emissions and tagged specific emission sources, and that could feed into our data, you're very welcome to send it to us, and we will take a look and do our best to integrate it if it's based on robust measurements.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for this additional explanation. And with that, I would really like to thank our presenters again, to Casey and Thomas. So it started to be regular once per year, but I would also like to invite everyone that communication, I mean, with us, with IEA, with all institutions actually should ongoing entire year, because tracker is published once per year, but preparation on it is going on immediately now for the next year. So with that, thank you very much. Thank you to presenters. Thank you to participants. You see that we announce new webinars in 1 month, and then spring will be more active than winter was. So stay tuned, check on our website, and see you before Easter.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.